can get another second round of relief. I think that there are people who are 1 or 2 checks away from being booted out of their apartments. Half of our country does not own stock. Guess what? I'm one of that half. When the stock market goes up or down, good for people who own stock. I'm not anti-stock, but I think what this crisis has shown is there's a big part of our country that just doesn't matter. I hope we can focus on those people first and then maybe get to the C-suite later on. So in terms of some of the money that's being under consideration, our airlines probably do need help. They got round 1, they're asking for $25 billion more, but perhaps for those big airlines, maybe we should start with a friendly loan and instead work toward grants towards small business owners and people who really didn't get focused on round 1.
Thank you. Next topic is around broadband access, the digital divide that we're seeing, especially among students. The pandemic has really brought to light the need for every student to have a device and have adequate home broadband connection. How would you propose modernizing the broadband funding and make sure that every student who needs broadband or has access to a device has this type of home connection?
Again, another very important question. When schools started open, we saw where all these issues hit all at once. Public safety, teacher safety, children's safety, and sometimes, you know, in Fallujah or Helmand, the generals I worked with and I only had bad options. So I actually have a lot of respect for anyone in government or in the chamber who are working through very difficult problems. There's no easy answer here. But as I was talking to some supporters and people in Iron County when COVID hit, what they said was, you know, the Chromebooks are on their way, but the bandwidth is not yet here. And that's the second poorest county in our state. So how did we get to the point where that gap was there before COVID? I'm glad that the relief is on its way. I'm glad that the students have their Chromebooks, but I think the bigger question is, how did we get to the inequity in CD2, which is a district I'm running in, where if you live in a certain zip code, your kids are okay, but if you live on the west side of Salt Lake or Kearns or West Valley or Tooele, they're not okay. That requires a lot of investment on the front end, not a 911 call at the back end. So what I support is a very serious effort to get broadband up and to make sure that it's sustained. And in some counties in rural Utah, you see that happening, but it's far from complete.
Let's shift our attention to healthcare, obviously an important issue that Congress has been dealing with for many, many years. In Utah, about 60% of individuals receive their health insurance through their employer. And for most businesses, it is one of their highest expenses. So this presents a dynamic where you have both families and businesses who are struggling to manage growing healthcare costs. What do you believe, Kael, are some of the key issues that Congress ought to be focused on, and not just focused, but addressing for urgent care and hopefully getting some of those challenges resolved?
Derek, great question. I see I've got 21 minutes left in this conversation, and I'm tempted to take 21 minutes, 36 seconds just to talk about this issue. However, I won't. 2 points. 82,000 kids in Utah don't have any insurance. We need to think about that. When Medicaid was expanded, there were certain people, certain politicians who supported that, and there was one party who fought very hard against that. I think it's a relevant data point. In terms of where we get our health care, I had the best health care imaginable. I had what any senator or member of Congress, including the opponent I'm running against, had. In the State Department for a decade, I never thought about health insurance. When I became a teacher and a writer a decade ago, I got on the Affordable Care Act. I've been on it ever since. Every September, I get a letter from Select Health, and I've got 10 days to decide what do I do. But this really isn't about me, but I think it's relevant that I'm a heck of a lot more relatable than a lot of politicians running this year. I do think about the person I spoke to last night in Farmington. And what she said is because of basically a $200 bill for unpaid medical costs, she cannot get a doctor to see her because it shows up on her record. The brittle system and the broken system was there before COVID. A model based on you only really get insurance if you have a job that provides for it doesn't help small business. I've got a younger brother who educates me regularly about how expensive that is for small businesses. But I'm running because I think policy is often about right and wrong. And on this issue, healthcare, until we get to for all, not for some, not for most, but for all, we are fundamentally failing the American people. I want to end with one thing for us to think about. If you're bored on I think today's Tuesday, it's all a blur right now, but if you're bored on a Tuesday, Google the World Happiness Index. And what the United Nations does is ask people, are you happy or not? Unfortunately, there's a lot of voters in CD2 and in Utah who I think would say, you know what, I'm not very happy. In fact, they're worried and concerned that they're going to go bankrupt over medical costs. When you look at countries that have decided that healthcare should not be for those who can afford it, or for those lucky enough, like members of Congress, or formerly for me, people do better, families do better, and most importantly, kids do better. So I'll promise you, if you support me, I will fight to keep your medical care and to make sure that my opponent, the Republican Party, do not take away protections as important as pre-existing conditions. Because right now, and what this mask represents, is that 7 million plus Americans now have a pre-existing condition, and it's called COVID-19.
Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about the political divide and the polarization that we see not only in Washington, but across the country. As a member of Congress, how will you help bridge those divides? How will you help make the country and our state more unified?
Thank you. Again, another really important question that I won't spend 18 minutes on, but please go to our website, westonforcongress.com. There's a lot of information about my biography. Again, what does 7 years and 2 wars teach you? It taught me that what should unite us and bring us together is a lot longer than that which divides us. When I was in Fallujah trying to rebuild the city and keep the Marines I worked with and the Iraqi leaders from being targeted and assassinated, it reminded me, what are the values that our country represents? So some politicians like to point at the flag or run to the middle of the stage and wrap themselves around the flag. What I'm always thinking is, what are the values behind that flag that we're fighting for? You know, when we pledge to our flag, which we've done from a young age, I like to slow us down when I'm in town halls and say, you know, when we say one country, indivisible, are we? I think that's being tested right now. My skills in these wars, I think, allowed me to try and bring former Taliban fighters to the table with my job in the State Department so they wouldn't shoot our troops. I never thought my experience in a war zone would actually apply to the state of the United States of America. It's very serious, and I think yet I've got that background. The other thing I would say is it's got to take a choice and it's got to take willpower. There's an edge that we're marching toward. Some of us are marching toward it fast. Some of us are maybe having second thoughts. I think this election is about all of us stepping back and saying we have a lot more in common than we have that divides us. But unfortunately, and I'll be blunt, I do not believe we can start to rebuild and repair if Donald Trump is reelected or people who blindly support him like my opponent.
So Kael, so far we've talked about the economy, healthcare, governing, political divides. Are you ready for an easy one?
I hope so. My favorite book?
No, this one is on racial and social justice.
Oh, right, yeah.
An issue that we have all been faced with over the last several weeks, an important issue. Although Utah is not always recognized as such, it is a diverse place. And here at the Salt Lake Chamber, we are actively engaged to make sure that this moment is not lost, that we truly focus on the importance of equality of opportunity, diversity, inclusion, and that this moment does not pass us without some important change. As a member of Congress representing Utah, how would you ensure that Utah is viewed as an example of a place where we can be diverse, but we can also be inclusive?
Well, this is a good example, I think, of, as a former history double major in college at the University of Utah, we need to be honest about our history. You know, the original sin of slavery is still with us, unfortunately, and it does none of us any good to pretend otherwise. But I'm seeking a job. When I run around Salt Lake to de-stress and remember my old life, I look at the signs that are up. And some include my name on it, and that's good for the ego, but those are far from the most important ones. The most important signs I run by are Black Lives Matter right now. But in my mind, I think, and then what? And then what? It's good that we're acknowledging that if you call 911, right now, I don't think we can all be confident that we're going to be treated the same way. And until we get there, and again, it goes to these words that we repeat but don't often slow down and think about, with liberty and justice for all. I'll just put the question to all of us, are we at for all yet? And I think to the Chamber's credit and to Governor Herbert's credit in many ways, he stood up on some issues that predated this. And that includes immigration, and I hope we get to that. That Utah working at its best is actually where our own story feeds into that we want to welcome people. We don't want to be a state, while getting increasingly diverse, that somehow points fingers and says, you're different, stay away, here's another wall to put in front of you. So what do we do? Again, when I run by those signs, I'm always thinking, if I get to Congress, what will I do? And I think there are some things we can do right away, which is to make sure that police reform is real. I'm not anti-police. I've got a very, very good friend she's not only a Marine, she's a former cop. And let me tell you, we have very frank conversations about what that balance needs to be. But until that for all is achieved, we'll fail people of color, just as COVID has hit different communities unequally. And that's where public policy, I think, can bring a lot of people up, help police, while most importantly, making sure that no one is singled out because of an adjective or because of a difference based on their birth. And those are the for all words that I always focus on when it comes to policy, really.
Next topic is Utah's influence in Washington. So we know that Utah really punches above its weight in so many areas, one of the strongest economies in the nation. As a member of Utah's congressional delegation, one, what will you do to make the Utah delegation more cohesive? And then two, how can you, as a representative in Congress, how can you help amplify Utah's influence in Washington?
Great, and power and influence aren't the same thing. I teach Marines, I teach midshipmen at the Naval Academy, and sometimes I ask, who's the most powerful person at the Naval Academy? Who's the most powerful person in Salt Lake City? And then I ask, well, who's the most influential? Power and influence are not the same thing. So while I'm proud of what Utah can speak to, I'll tell you, if you're a member of Congress and you're part of the minority party, you're not very powerful, but you can still be influential. I'm running to be a member of the majority party in Congress. And let me tell you, you may have a fancy seat on a big committee, but if you're in the minority party, as Republicans are today, that does not translate into either power and sometimes influence based on how you behave. So how do we build better relations? I'm instinctively diplomatic. I don't like the poison in politics. I was a writer before, and I'll be a writer for the rest of my life. I'm pretty comfortable in front of a computer screen thinking about why words matter. Words matter in legislation. If laws are intentionally vague, that can be used to abuse people and to hurt people. If words are clear or intent is clear, you can actually help people. What I would promise to do is two things. And again, this question's too bad I can't take more time. Whichever county votes the most against me, I'll get there first and I'll say, obviously it didn't work, you still don't like me, but let's start the conversation again. The second thing I would do, if elected, is find on paper the Republican who seems to be the most opposite from me. And I'd say, you know what, I like the James A. Baker model of listening. James A. Baker was George Herbert Walker Bush's Secretary of State. And when he was talking to the Russians about very serious issues like nuclear arms reduction, guess where he had those conversations? I wish it was Utah, but it was up in Wyoming. He went and fished on the Snake River. He went to Jenny Lake and to Jackson Lake Lodge. And if you're ever up there, there's a little wood table by the gift shop, and there's an old Soviet flag and an American flag. That's the model I would like, which is to get to Grand Staircase and say, guess what? We're going to go on a 4-hour hike. Unlike my opponent and others, I actually camped for real. And I'll tell you, when you're around a campfire for a long time, you get past the BS, you get past the simple talking points, and you actually get to what's important. And you do it under dark skies in Utah, which I think remind us all that in the 80 or 90 years we're here, we should sure try and find common ground to help each other, because what I believe is we're all just trying to get through life as best we can. And government, I think, has a role in making sure, whether Republican or Democrat, to not forget that. Party registration is not what's going to determine who I represent. If I'm fortunate enough to get your support and win, I will represent everyone in CD2, not just Democrats, not just those disaffected Republicans like Mitt Romney, who are probably, perhaps going to vote for Biden. He's definitely not voting for Trump. I want to represent everyone, and I want to bring our country and our state back from that edge. No one should want to jump off that, because again, I've seen the red rip. In a place in Fallujah, when people start to turn on each other, civil unrest goes up. It's a very hard cycle to stop once it starts.
One of the challenges that we face in Utah is a housing shortage. And it is true not just of Utah, but in the West. Members of the Salt Lake Chamber are increasingly concerned that employees can't find housing, let alone affordable housing, especially when it's near their place of work. Do you believe that the federal government has a role in addressing the need for affordable housing in your district?
I do, and I think every level of government does, actually, not just the federal level. We've got great executive leadership. I'll start with Governor Herbert on some key issues, but particularly I think our two mayors, Mayor Wilson, please support her, and Mayor Mendenhall. But there's a good model here. What our federal government has done through the VA. Salt Lake City and Utah has been very effective at making sure our veteran community is not homeless. But I'll back us up a little bit, Derek. While I think big companies are rightly concerned about whether their employees can afford a $2,000 one-room apartment, and a lot of those buildings going up that are at least $2,000 a month, there's a pre-existing homeless issue in this city. And I get people who say, Kael, what are you going to do about homelessness? And it's two parts. One is people don't want bicycles stolen, and in their view, the homeless do that. And then there are other people saying, hey, it's a human value issue. And both are legitimate issues for anyone running to represent a district of 700,000 people to address. So I would start with the people who never ask me for a yard sign, because guess what? They don't have a yard because they don't have a home. And then I would get to, how do we get people who are probably making 80 or 90 or 100 plus $1,000 a year, want to live in the avenues, but can't afford maybe an $800,000 house, which used to be maybe $500,000 or $300,000 10 years ago. So again, the forgotten people in this district are not worried about the $2,500 a month apartment. They're worried about being booted out of their apartments if we don't get a second round of COVID relief. So I'm prioritizing the most vulnerable, the most needy among us. But to your credit, and I give the chamber a lot of credit, we've got beautiful mountains. We've got, I think, good people overall. We've got an ethics in this state that's very attractive. The best thing I think that can happen is that we do manage this growth and increasingly say to people, you're welcome here. You may not think Utah's diverse, but I think we are. And our own story, I think, is something the more people understand, the more we can deal with all these other challenges about that growth, which of course includes pollution and climate issues as well.
With the recent tariffs and pandemic, supply lines for our goods and manufactured products have been strained. And again, this is something we hear from our businesses here in Utah all the time. How would you go about, or what are your thoughts on increasing our domestic manufacturing and critical supply chain logistics?
Well, I honestly wrote my opponent a letter at the end of March, and I asked, did he support the use of the Defense Production Act? I also asked whether or not he agreed with President Trump that COVID would be basically over by Easter. There were other issues I raised, but I never heard back. So when it comes, I think, to what we need to do at the federal level, the first thing we need to do is not point fingers at various governors and say it's your fault. Leadership for me, and I follow in my own career in government, the State Department, I had ambassadors who were mentors, and I worked with a lot of generals, Marine generals particularly. And what I loved about the ambassador general model of leadership, particularly in a war zone, is you didn't lay blame on other people. You bucked up, you found your spine, and occasionally, you know, you were the only one in the room. And instead, what COVID has shown is a lot of finger pointing. And it's not just Republicans, but I'd say overwhelmingly, unfortunately, it's more one party than another. But I'm always looking for the leaders that are willing to say, hey, I run toward challenges. You know, the time in America for small people in big jobs and soft people in hard jobs needs to be behind us. Because if we don't get people who are up to the challenge, this slippery slope of more civil unrest, more economic inequality is going to continue. So what I would favor is actually the use of the Defense Production Act early on. I think one of the things that both parties have highlighted, and perhaps the Republicans even more, is where are we producing things? And are we paying labor enough that we're incentivizing people to stay with those jobs inside our borders? And I think that that's a legitimate area where we need to look at policies that keep incredibly important national security related items close to home. And that should be one of the benefits we take out of this horrible public health crisis that COVID still represents.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you hope that we could talk more about immigration, and that time is upon us.
Good.
It's the position of the Salt Lake Chamber that our current immigration system is not working, that it's broken. It creates uncertainty for those who are trying to navigate that system, and it also creates economic uncertainty for Utah employers in, I think it's fair to say, every sector of the economy. As a member of Congress representing Utah, what would you do to address the immigration system?
And I've got 3 minutes, and I'm going to use as much time as I can on this. This is about another right and wrong. The world right now looks at us and says, you're a country of walls, you're a country of drawbridges. You're no longer a country where the dreams of the world are with you. Trust me, I know. I've got a lot of friends around the world in all governments, basically, given my former job. And they're rooting for us to do the right thing this election. This, unfortunately, represents the worst devils of our nature. You know, it was Abraham Lincoln, the founder of the modern Republican Party, who said, we need to grab hold on the better angels. I'm focused on a couple of things. One is TPS, temporary protected status. I have a friend whose grandmother cleans Dodger Stadium. So when I wake up and think about what needs to change, someone at the age of 75 who's cleaning a stadium in California should not worry about her status. Donald Trump and Chris Stewart, I think, don't really care about people like that. I'll let him speak for himself. This issue has become so politicized, but to the credit of Utah, and Derek, to your point, the Utah Compact actually led in many important ways. And I give credit to both Republicans and Democrats in Utah. But if we don't look out for the most vulnerable among us, it's not only going to hurt the business owners, it's actually going to hurt families, real people. What my time in the State Department taught me is that policy is not a theoretical thing. When policy fails and policy making is led by people who put self-interest or self-absorption first, the people who pay the highest price are the immigrants. And guess what? We're a nation of immigrants. We just celebrated the indigenous populations in our country. I wrote a book where I started out talking about when Custer went to Wyoming, guess what? He promised he would never touch his finger on another Native American, and we know how that story ended. So let's come together on this issue. I think Utah is a good model in that regard, and Utah could help, I think, bring our country to a better place on immigration. But we got to understand, if we're talking walls, that's not going to make this situation better.
Kael, you notice that we just have about a minute left.
Yep.
And so we want to first thank you for joining us and give you the last minute if there's anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to cover.
Thank you, Derek. And, you know, I've been asked this before, and beware when you give a wannabe politician the final word. But the one issue that we really as a country need to cover, and I'm glad I'm in the chamber when I'm raising this, is money in politics. If there's one failing of our system right now, it's who gets a voice in the room when laws are made. I get the $2,800 checks and I get the adrenaline rush, but like I said, it makes me feel bad. When I see in our category people who are donating $5 because they're unemployed, or we've got an Amazon delivery truck driver who's donating, those are the people we all need to look out for. So if there's one issue I'd love to work, it's to try and get money out of politics as much as we can. I believe it's almost criminal that millions of dollars are being spent at a time when huge numbers of American families are hurting. And it's on both sides. We need to get money out of politics. And I commit to all of you, if you hire me, I would love to have a constitutional conversation about getting money out of politics, because that's what's screwing all of us, basically. And so thank you for the final word, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Kael Weston is a candidate for the 2nd Congressional District from the state of Utah. Thanks, Kael, for joining us. We'll take a short break as we transition to our next candidate. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to the candidate forum for the 2nd Congressional District. I'm going to turn the time back to Nathan to introduce Congressman Chris Stewart.
Thank you, Derek, and welcome Congressman Chris Stewart. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll jump into the Q&A session. Congressman Stewart is the current congressman from the Utah's 2nd Congressional District. He is a New York Times best-selling and national award-winning author, Air Force pilot, and the former owner, CEO of a small business. Chris is one of 10 children and grew up on a dairy farm in Cache Valley. He graduated from Utah State University, where he earned his degree in economics. Upon graduation, Chris joined the United States Air Force, where he was the distinguished graduate, which means he was the top of his class in both officer training school and undergraduate pilot training. He served for 14 years as a pilot in the Air Force. He holds 3 world speed records, including the world's record for the fastest nonstop flight around the world. Chris is a prolific author, having written 17 books, several of which have become national bestsellers and have been published in 6 different countries. Before being elected to Congress, Chris served as president and CEO of the Shipley Group, a consulting expertise with expertise in energy and the environment. He and his wife, Evie, are the parents of 6 children. So again, welcome, Congressman. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. The first question is really more of an open-ended question. For those who do not know you yet, what do they need to know as they decide whether to vote for you?
Well, first, let me say thank you. Thanks for inviting me with Chamber, obviously. We've developed great friendships as a previous small business owner. I have great sympathy for the challenges that small businesses and large businesses have, and particularly over the last 6 or 8 months, but also for the great rewards. I mean, it's one of the most satisfying things. It's really kind of the American dream, isn't it, to be successful in business and build a business. And it's good to be with you. It's funny, I was trying to call in and I had a participant code and I thought, oh, this is going to be bad. I'm not going to be able to say anything. So it's not going to be that interesting if no one's there to actually answer your question. So I'm glad we got that sorted out. One of those panic moments, right, when you're on the wrong end, but glad we got it settled. And so I think the question was, basically, I'll rephrase it, but you're asking, what's my argument for why should someone vote for me? Is that it? Well, that's a very common question. And honestly, if you have any sense of humility about you, it's a kind of a difficult question to answer, because you don't want to stand on a soapbox and say, what a great guy I am. I'm the obvious choice, vote for me. I think it comes down to a couple things, maybe 3. You obviously want your representative to be someone of character and integrity. Someone who's honest, someone who works hard. I think you want someone who will listen to you. I had a town hall meeting in Salt Lake where we had more than 1,000 people, and they were all angry, all screaming. There wasn't a single person in that crowd, and it was really almost 1,300 people. None of them agreed with me, but I felt like, and as I said to them, it's my job to give you a chance to tell me what's on your mind, to tell me, what's important to you. So I think there's an element of character to it, but I also think more than that, it's after that, there's the philosophy. And do the things that you believe match the majority of your constituents? Look, no one is going to agree with you all the time. And if a politician agrees with you all the time, it's because they're lying to you. But the reality is that the majority of this district is a conservative district, and I am a conservative. As you guys know, because you've heard me preach about this for a long time, I believe in American idealism, American exceptionalism, the idea that America is good. I believe in traditional values like the sanctity of life, religious liberty. I think this talk, an actual serious conversations about are we going to accept socialism and socialist policies into our economic model and into our governance, I think that's nonsense. I think free market capitalism has done more good than any other philosophy of how to govern or how to manage an economy than any other example in the world. And at the end of the day, I think those values reflect most of the values that people in the district want to have represented for them. And I guess maybe I'd add the one other thing, and that is, I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years now, and most of the district knows me. And I think that, like I said, not all of them are going to appreciate, the work that I do or agree with the things that I do. But I do think they know me, and it helps when you go to make those arguments to say, yeah, I've heard Chris say that, and he's been consistent, and at least he's trying to be fair and honest about that.
Thank you.
Congressman, obviously like the rest of us, that we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's having both health consequences as well as economic consequences. And so we will want to talk about both of those issues. Let's talk about the economy first. The current pandemic, the health, the economic crisis, it has commanded everyone's attention. As a member of Congress, what do you feel should be the number one priority for the short-term economic recovery and then for the long-term economic recovery?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the short term, there's only one answer to that question. That is, you have to get people back to work. You have to keep the economy growing. You have to give people the confidence to know that they can go to work, that they can go to school, that they can travel for business or travel for leisure. I mean, that is the only answer. Now, of course, how do you do that? I really think one of the most remarkably positive thing that's happened with coronavirus is this Operation Warp Speed. That is where the president brought, a dozen or more of some of the largest pharmaceutical and companies that make medicines and other medical research. He brought them together, and he challenged them: find the remedies, find the treatments, and develop an immunization. Congress appropriated $10 billion to finding an immunization, which is, by the way, more than twice as much as the rest of the world combined. And we're going to develop an immunization for this, and it's not going to take 10 or 12 years like it typically would. We're going to do it in something like 8 or 10 months, maybe 12 months. And we'll go through all of the normal procedures, all of the normal trials, all of the normal safety protocols to make sure that it's safe. That's an incredible achievement. Another one is that we've reduced the fatality rate on this virus 60% in 6 or 7 months. That again is a remarkable achievement. So I think in the short term, that's what you have to do, is give people insurance. Yeah, we're going to find medical solutions to this. We're going to make it safe for you to return to work. And I think in the long term, then you have to look, we've got an economic hole that we've dug here. There's our debt, there's the unemployment, there are long-term consequences, it's including delays in education for some people. And that's going to take us a little longer to kind of work our way through. But the thing that does that, again, it's not the heavy hand of government. It's to do what we did in the last 4 years, turn the economy loose. And I'll just end by saying this. There was a reason we had the strongest economy in my lifetime. There was a reason we had the lowest unemployment rate ever for African Americans and Hispanic community, because President Trump turned the economy loose. He unleashed the economy by deregulation, by cutting taxes, by encouraging economic growth. And I have no question, we'll get back to that, after we get through this pandemic. And last thing, Utah's been a leader on that. We once again have the lowest unemployment rate in the country. There's a reason why things are going so well in Utah.
Next topic is around broadband access and the digital divide that we see, especially among students. And this pandemic, I think, has brought to light the need for every student to have a device and have adequate home broadband connection. how would you propose modernizing the broadband funding and make sure that every student who has a need has a device and a home connection?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And fortunately for you guys, that won't take me as long to answer as the previous one on the pandemic, which is actually a little more complicated. Look, there's a role that the federal government can play, and there's a role that we have played. And that's where my role on the Appropriations Committee can be critically important for rural Utah, for the rural West. You know, we have some of the most remote counties in the entire lower United States in my district. And whether it's a postal service or whether it's broadband internet, it's harder for them. It's more expensive. And obviously you don't have the economies of scale like you do along the Wasatch Front. So the federal government has programs, and I have supported those programs where we help to bring broadband and increase spectrum to rural communities. And I think that's an appropriate role for the federal government. I don't think the federal government should do everything, but there's some things that we can do, we're uniquely positioned to do, and that we should do. And I've supported those. Now, the second answer to the question deals with, the educational impacts of that. And that, fortunately, because I think this is something that should be done and should be managed by the states. And I say fortunate because that's the way it's designed as it should be. That should be a state issue. That should be up to our governor, to our legislators, and to our state school boards. And this maybe has highlighted that there is a bit of a digital divide. And I think, well, I know that they're looking to address that. And I'm confident they will. One last thing on this, and speaking more broadly now than just the broadband, no pun intended, or the technological access, and that is the reality that the COVID has shown us, and that is it has had a disproportionate negative impact on minority communities, on the lower income communities, and on our children. If you're 18 and a senior in high school and you now have to have your education online, you're capable of doing that. If you're 6 or 7 years old, it's much, much harder for them. And I think that's something we really haven't done a very good job at, is realizing you take a bunch of first or second graders and try and teach them online. Very difficult to do. I come from a family of educators. My parents, my wife, some of my sons and my daughters are teachers. And one of my daughters who teaches grade school education, she tells me all the time, this is really, really hard on her kids, not being able to have that face-to-face contact with the teacher like they're used to.
Let's turn our attention now to healthcare. As I mentioned earlier, Utah is a state where 60% of individuals receive their healthcare through their employment. And at the same time, it is also the second highest business expense for employers, which means that both Utah businesses as well as Utah families are struggling to manage growing healthcare costs. You know, as a current member of Congress, this is something that Congress has dealt with for a long time. What do you believe Congress needs to do in order to address this urgent need?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, Derek, that I was a small business owner. And, when I say small business, I had maybe 30, 32 employees. But like a lot of small businesses, we had some good years and we had some struggling years. And I remember the absolute fear of making payroll when I didn't know if I'd have the money to make payroll. And every year we went through another fearful experience, and that was, how do we buy and provide health care for our employees? And most of my employees were married. They all had families, and it wasn't just them. We were providing health care for their families. And as you said, Derek, it became incredibly expensive. Every year it was like this gut check about how can we, because we knew we'd have to renew, is it going to be an 18% increase? Is it going to be a 20% increase? And it's a real stress for businesses. And as a result of that, some of them have started cutting back. Okay, so now to answer your question, here's the thing. The law of the land right now is Obamacare. That's the law that we're all living under, including business owners. I am under Obamacare. I have to have it because I have to be under Obamacare, so I'm in Congress, and I know how expensive it is. And the way you increase access is you drive down the cost. And there's ways to do that, and they're not that complicated. And before I say that, I got to interject this, because the reality is that many of my Democratic colleagues in the media, unfortunately, will lie again and again and again. and say that I and Republicans want to repeal the provision that protects pre-existing conditions. It's absolute nonsense. It's not true now, and it's never been true. I have never voted and would never vote for something that didn't protect pre-existing conditions. And by the way, there's never been a Republican plan that suggested that. And the same thing for keeping your children on health care. Your policy as a parent till you're age 26. That's actually a Republican proposal that goes back to the late 1990s. So those two things are given. Protect pre-existing conditions, allow your children to stay on until they're 26, now try to drive down costs. Medicare Part D is a great example of how you can do that. You drive down costs there, you increase access. You can do it by allowing to buy across state lines. I've had a personal experience of that where I moved and I had a policy in one state. I moved a few miles across the state border, couldn't buy the same policy in another state. Why is that? I wanted the policy I had before and couldn't do it. Driving down a cost could be accomplished by expanding the market one more. I don't need maternity insurance. I'm pretty sure my wife and I aren't going to have any more children. Why do I have to buy a policy that provides for maternity coverage? Allowing people to choose a policy that's more specific to them. I mean, those are the kind of things you do to drive down costs. And by driving down costs, you increase access for people. I love your questions, and I'm sorry if my answers are long, but they're complicated questions. You guys have taken on the virus, you've taken on healthcare, you've taken on education. These are not yes or no kind of questions, and I appreciate that. But again, I'm sorry if I go into more detail than you want. But again, these are very detailed, very complicated questions, and I'm glad we have a chance to talk about them.
Format of this forum is you get to take as much time as you want. You could take 29 minutes to answer one question. The time is yours, so take as much as you want.
That'd be poor form though, wouldn't it, Derek? Unless you ask me about flying jets, in which case I'd probably talk for all 29 minutes.
All right. Well, on that topic, let's talk about the political divide and the polarization that we see not only in DC but across the country. It seems like it's becoming more and more divided, more and more polarized. As a member of Congress, how will you help bridge those divides, and how will you help make the country and our state more unified?
I think that might be the most important thing we talk about today. And when you look at the future of our nation, that is the thing that worries me more than anything else. And if there's anything that is going to threaten the future of our country, it's the division to the point where some people throw up their hands and lose faith in the unity of their nation. And a part of the reason is because some of the issues that divide us are very important. And they're also, the answers are not obvious sometimes. We have to work our way through them. You know, my Democrat opponent, I honestly haven't taken the time to really follow him at all. And I'm busy, and I just feel he's going to go make his arguments, and I'm going to make mine. So I've never listened to him or followed what he says. But you know, I got on this call a few minutes early, and I heard him say that, you know, Chris Stewart doesn't care about, he was talking about poor people who are cleaning stadiums, I thought. He said, Chris Stewart doesn't care about those people. Well, what nonsense. And is that the kind of thing that divides us? Or is that the kind of thing that unites us? I mean, so I would start it out by saying, let's not insult our political opponents and attribute to them the very worst characteristics of saying they don't care about people. You can have a discussion or disagreements on what's the right political philosophy, what's the right economic policy, but I don't think you start out by saying, well, this person doesn't care or this is a bad person. I don't think that helps the conversation. And let me give you examples of things that I've been able to do in a bipartisan way, which was very difficult, by the way. And then I'll maybe conclude by saying why I think we were able to do it. Here's a good example. Wild horses in the Western states. This was a very emotional and divisive issue because you had horse advocates and others who were saying, you're going to kill these animals. And then you had others like me saying, no, we're not. We're trying to protect them. And it was like 4 or 5 years of kind of political down in the dirt, hand-to-hand combat to try to convince people we're trying to save these horses. But we put an incredible coalition together. I think, frankly, it's one of the most unique coalitions in all of federal government, where we brought horse activists, the Humane Society, ranchers and farmers, federal and state and county governments, and we found a solution. And people didn't think we could, and we did, but it took time. Here's another one, FISA reform, which is our Department of Justice and FBI shouldn't be able to use their power to violate the privacy and the constitutional rights of individual citizens. That's something that, again, is a very divisive topic right now, but we've been able to build a coalition around the intelligence community, Republicans and Democrats, to revise that. Even another one, 988, took us 4 years. But we had more than 200 co-sponsors on that, including a bunch of Democrats. And the answer is how you do it. One is that you be patient, you work hard, you be honest, and you don't insult people. Because if you're trying to bring people together, a great technique is not to alienate them by saying negative comments about them rather than trying to build a positive environment. I think if we do those things, we'll figure out all of these other problems as well.
Stay on the theme of bridging divides and talk for a moment about racial and social justice. Although Utah is not always recognized as such, it is a diverse place. And here at the Salt Lake Chamber, we have been actively engaged to make sure that this moment is one of where we focus on equality and opportunity, diversity and inclusion, and making sure that the moment doesn't pass us by without making important changes and improvements. As a member of Congress, how would you ensure that Utah is viewed as a place that is equitable, that it is diverse and inclusive?
Yeah, you know, Utah, as I said earlier, we lead the nation in a lot of different ways. And I think this is one example where we lead in one of the most important ways. And I have to start by saying, all of us need to look at our own actions, our own hearts, and the people around us. Are there things that we could do better? And the truth is there probably are for most of us. And whether it's in how we treat one another, whether it's, you know, a racial divide or perhaps an economic divide, a religious divide, you know, whether it's how do we look at someone who's an immigrant, do we look at them differently? Every one of those things and more is something that we could look at one another, our friends and our neighbors, and say, are we treating each other the way we should treat each other? And Derek, I'm going to answer this one simply rather than go into detail, because I really think the answers to this are just this simple. I believe that we are all children of the same God. We should treat each other that way. And if we see things that aren't right, we should try to correct those. One of my faith leaders said a couple weeks ago, we need to change the world one heart, one family, one community at a time. And I think that's exactly right. But Utah, I think, look, again, we're not perfect, but we really, I think, are uniquely positioned to lead on this because we really do have a bit of a softer culture here. A high number of people in Utah have lived in other nations. We welcome immigrants. We welcome refugees. I'm proud of that. I support that. And I'm glad that that's kind of the culture here in our state.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Utah's influence in Washington. As we know, Utah punches above its weight in so many areas, one of the leading economies in the nation. As a member of Utah's congressional delegation, what do you think you can do to help amplify Utah's influence in DC?
Well, Utah's got an amplified influence, whether I you know, am a proponent of that or not, or anyone else. The reality is just looking at our state, it's attractive to people, and it has been for a long time. I mean, in my time in Congress, it's gone from when I first would tell people I'm from Utah, they'd say, oh, that's nice. And they usually thought of the Mighty Five. You know, this very successful advertising campaign where we invited people to come see the incredible national parks that are here. That's one of the first responses. But after that, it was more than that. It was like, hey, I hear you guys are like the best managed state for 3 years in a row. Hey, I hear you guys have the lowest unemployment rate. The lowest, or one of the most promising places to build a business or to bring a business. There are things about Utah that people around the country and even around the world recognize as very positive. And we lead in other ways as well that we can facilitate. For example, I think one of the most important pieces of legislation that I will ever work on or write while I'm in Congress is the Fairness for All Act, where we took what is to my point, a model here in Utah, which was Utah Compromise, where we said we can protect religious liberty and at the same time make sure that people aren't discriminated in the public sphere, whether it's in employment or housing, that we can protect those people as well. And it's a rewrite of the civil rights law that is generational. It's taken 3.5 years to do. Again, we have a coalition to do that. You know, for those who say that I'm divisive, again, I just think that's nonsense. For heaven's sakes, I've been so successful in bringing coalitions together, and this is an example of it. Some of the largest gay right, LGBTQ activists and groups in the country are a part of this coalition. Members of the Catholic faith, Catholic leaders, the Seventh-day Adventists, my own faith. And this is a great example of where Utah can lead. We will take the Utah model and apply it on a federal scale. And as I said, it will be a generational rewriting of the civil rights law that will guarantee two very important rights: religious liberty and non-discrimination. And I'm very, very proud of that.
Lots of good things are indeed happening in Utah, but we're not without our challenges. And one of those challenges is the greatest housing shortage and affordability challenges in the West. Members of the chamber, as businesses, are increasingly concerned that their employees can't find affordable housing, let alone housing that's near their place of employment. Do you believe that the federal government has a role in addressing affordable housing in your district?
Well, I mean, I know that there's a bit of a push to have, you know, from Vice President Biden and others, they would essentially like the federal government to take over local zoning ordinances. I think that'd be a terrible mistake. And I think actually the federal government should stay out of zoning and housing issues in that regard. This is by and large a state and a local issue. And by the way, Derek, I see it as well. With my own children, some of them live out of state, but some of them live here. And it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge for someone who's just starting a career to find affordable housing, like you said, especially something close to where they work. That can be impossible, virtually impossible for someone who's just starting out. And here's this irony, and I think you'll understand why I'm smiling about this. I view my job to build the economy, to get people to, so they all have great jobs, you know, make more money, and to have the economy grow. And then state leaders and local leaders have to figure out a way to make housing for those people as they come here and as they get these kind of jobs. So I wish I could say that in Washington, D.C., we could fix the housing shortage in Farmington, but the truth is we probably can't. That's going to have to done, again, be done by the state leaders, by local zoning, by city councils and by mayors, and a coordinated effort between all of them. But look, I sincerely hope and will work with them in any way I can to help them be successful, because it's one of the huge challenges we have for our future. The last thing we want is for Wasatch Front to be like Silicon Valley, where no one can afford to live here, and our young kids have to move somewhere else because they just simply can't afford to buy a home here.
Shifting gears here, with the recent tariffs and pandemic, supply lines for our goods and manufactured products have been strained. How would you go about, or what are your thoughts on increasing our domestic manufacturing and critical supply chain logistics?
Yeah, so Nathan, I'm going to answer that quickly again if I could, because if not, it's a long conversation. I think most Americans would be shocked in January if you told them, did you know that 97% of our generic drugs are made in China, or about the same percentage of our antibiotics are made in China? I mean, all of us, I think, were surprised at that. And that's just one example of how we've got a supply chain interruption that wasn't healthy and not, you know, it was good in many ways, it was efficient in many ways, but it wasn't really healthy for the long-term economic viability of our own markets and our own economy. And that's why I would absolutely support and have supported incentivizing companies to bring some of that work back to the US, incentivizing companies to partner with our allies rather than with China on those things. I think when I was growing up on a farm, I wouldn't have imagined that you could bale hay in Utah and sell it in Japan or in China. And would have been fantastical to me. I mean, our idea of selling hay was to sell it to the neighbor, not to sell it in China. But that's a great example of the global interconnectedness of our economy and our world right now. And bottom line is this: we can't leave ourselves vulnerable to who are potentially our adversaries on this. It's not smart economically, and it's not smart from a national security perspective. And I'm really, really glad that business leaders are starting to see that. And this isn't just because of the virus, by the way. They started to see that a couple of years ago as we on the intelligence community began to make information available to business leaders saying, this is what you're really dealing with, but particularly with China. And for them to relook that threat and say, well, we want to diversify. We want to have more trusted partners. We want to know that if there's a problem in the future, that we're going to be able to maintain our supply chain. And that's just been accelerated now over the last 6 or 7 months. But it's a good thing that that's taking place.
Congressman, we have just under a minute left, and we want to give you the last word. If there's anything we haven't talked about, if you'd like to share, go ahead.
Well, you know, it's a great interview, great questions. And as I said, you can tell they're great questions when it elicits a lot of conversation, a lot of information. Hope we've been able to do that. Thank you for the invitation here. Thanks to both of you for your leadership. As I said, 60% of our economy is based on small business. The model for the rest of the world is a free market capitalism that drives the entrepreneurship, the creative genius, the magic that is the US economy and has been for generations. The American dream actually means something, which is why tens of millions of people around the world want to come to this country. We've been given the greatest gift in this nation. We appreciate your involvement and the economic miracle of providing jobs and employment for people. We want to help you. Thank you for the invitation to be here today.
Chris Stewart, candidate for Congress from Utah's 2nd Congressional District. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to both of our candidates today, and thanks to you for joining us as well. Please remember, we have remaining forums in this series. This Thursday, we will hear from an expert panel on Amendment G. This is the ballot measure to amend Utah's state constitution and address our education funding. And next week on Tuesday, we will hear from the 3rd Congressional District candidates and members of the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission who will talk about judicial retention elections. You can find out more about these and other events at slchamber.com. Thanks.